Months before she dies, Cleopatra begins a private experiment. Condemned prisoners, brought in one at a time under guard, a cup here, a snake there, while she watches without flinching because she wants to know with total certainty which death hurts least. Not cruelty, research. She already knows what's coming for her. And when it arrives, this will be the one decision in the entire war still hers to make. When the day finally comes, she uses exactly what she's learned. Soldiers come pounding up the staircase, boots on stone, shouting at each other to move faster. Octavian wants her taken alive. He's made that clear more than once. They break the door down, braced for a struggle, a chase, a woman begging for her life. Instead, silence. She's already on the throne, in the full royal regalia of a pharaoh, gone. Completely. Whatever they came to take isn't in that room anymore. She spent months making sure of it. Here's the strange part. 2,000 years later, Octavian got what he wanted anyway. He never had her body, but he ended up owning her story instead. The woman who tested her own death like a scientist, who ran a kingdom, who spoke 9 languages and outlasted 2 of the most powerful men Rome ever produced, has been almost entirely replaced by a version her enemies built to destroy her. And it worked so well that we call it history. By the end of this video, you'll be able to point to the exact afternoon her real story ends, and the invented one takes over. And you'll see that the same thing she used to build 18 years of real power is what was used to erase her. This isn't a love story, whatever the barge and the poetry might suggest. It's a story about who gets to hold the pen once someone else is writing your story instead of you. Picture growing up in a household where the people closest to you in age are also, statistically, your most likely assassins. That's not a metaphor for Cleopatra's childhood. That was just the actuarial reality of being born a Ptolemy. Her family had ruled Egypt from Alexandria for 2.5 centuries. Macedonian Greeks, descended from one of Alexander the Great's own generals, who never fully became Egyptian and never fully trusted each other either. Siblings married siblings to keep the bloodline pure. Siblings also, on a fairly regular schedule, murdered each other to keep the throne uncontested. By the time Cleopatra was born, this wasn't backstory. It was simply how power changed hands in her family. Poison, exile, or a blade, rarely a peaceful succession. A crown, in this family, never protected anyone. It just made you easier to find. There's one other family trait she inherited, and it's the one that matters most for the rest of this story. For 250 years, the Ptolemies had sold Egypt an illusion. To their Egyptian subjects, they didn't present themselves as foreign occupiers. They presented themselves as living gods, carving themselves into Egyptian religious imagery, generation after generation. It was survival technology wearing the mask of religion. A family with no real Egyptian bloodline, ruling almost entirely on the strength of a story told convincingly enough to be believed. Her father forgot that lesson, and it nearly cost him everything. Egypt was independently wealthy, but politically weak. And Ptolemy XII spent much of his reign bribing Rome directly, paying enormous sums to Roman power brokers, including a young Julius Caesar, just to have his rule recognized. When his own people threw him out anyway, he didn't rebuild support at home. He fled to Rome and paid again for a foreign army to march in and reinstall him by force. Cleopatra was around 11 when this happened. That contrast says almost everything about the rest of this story. Her father treated Rome like a landlord to be kept happy, pay enough, and the throne stays rented in your name. He never gave anyone, Roman or Egyptian, a real reason to believe in him. Just a reason to put up with him. It cost him a fortune and left him with nothing but resentment. His daughter did the opposite. Not bribery, leverage. She made herself useful in a way no one could easily replace. Intellect, administration, personal alliance. She spent the rest of her life proving she'd learned that lesson better than anyone else in her family ever had. By every surviving account, she was formidably educated, fluent in her native Koine Greek, and, unlike every Ptolemy who ruled Egypt before her, she also learned Egyptian, the language of the people she governed. Plutarch, writing a century later, claims she needed no interpreter for envoys from Ethiopia, Arabia, Judea, Syria, Media, and Parthia, moving between languages the way most rulers barely moved between rooms. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Every other Ptolemy before her ruled Egypt for 250 years without bothering to learn the language of the people they ruled. Cleopatra did, not for sentiment, but because a queen who could speak to her own population directly in their own language needed a lot less Roman muscle to enforce her rule than one who couldn't. She inherited the throne at 18, co-ruling with a 10-year-old brother she was required, by Ptolemaic custom, to marry. It should have been survivable. It nearly wasn't, because the men running the palace on her brother's behalf had already decided she was the one loose thread left to cut. By 48 BC, the regents running her brother Ptolemy XIII's court had pushed Cleopatra out of Alexandria entirely, forcing her into exile with what allies she could gather. On paper, her story should end there. A teenage queen, deposed, with no army and no obvious path back. Then, Rome's civil war washed up on Egypt's doorstep. Pompey the Great, fleeing defeat by Julius Caesar, arrived seeking refuge in Alexandria. And Ptolemy's advisors, hoping to win Caesar's favor cheaply, had him murdered on the beach the moment he stepped ashore. Caesar arrived days later in pursuit, and instead of gratitude, he was disgusted. He'd wanted his rival captured or defeated on his own terms, not handed to him as a corpse by strangers currying favor. This is the opening Cleopatra had been waiting for, and she took it with the same instinct her family had used for generations. Stage the moment. It's night, and every gate into the palace is being watched by her brother's men. Cleopatra has herself sewn into a bedsack, some accounts say a carpet, and carried straight through the checkpoints on the back of one servant, a man named Apollodorus, because nobody stops a servant hauling bedding in the dark. That's the whole plan. Then she sat down in front of Caesar, and the sack comes undone. Whatever Caesar expected when a rolled carpet hit the floor of his quarters, it wasn't a queen stepping out of it, already composed, already talking, before he'd had time to react to the theatre of it. Cleopatra understood something her brother's advisors never grasped. Caesar hadn't come to Egypt looking for a defeated child king's court. He'd come looking for someone he could negotiate with as an equal. She couldn't get through the front door, so she turned the back door into something he'd never forget. Caesar backed her claim to the throne. It cost a war, the brief, brutal Alexandrian War fought in the streets and harbour of Alexandria itself. And it cost her brother his life, drowned in the Nile fleeing the fighting. But it worked. Cleopatra was restored, this time with Rome's most powerful man as her personal guarantor, and within the year, she'd given birth to a son. She named him Caesarion, Little Caesar, and made no secret that he was Caesar's own. Hold on to that child for later. Right now, he looks like a triumph. Proof Cleopatra had turned herself into something Rome could not simply discard. By the end of this story, he's the reason her line doesn't survive her. She followed the alliance to Rome itself, taking up residence at Caesar's private villa while he was still, technically, married to a Roman wife. It was a scandal by design, not by accident. A foreign queen, visibly present at the center of Roman power, a living reminder that Caesar's ambitions might extend past the Republic altogether. It worked as intended, stirring up exactly the mix of fascination and alarm Cleopatra needed to matter in Rome, until March of 44 BC, when Caesar was assassinated on the floor of the Senate by men who feared, among other things, that a foreign queen at his side meant he wanted to make himself a king. Cleopatra fled back to Egypt within weeks. Her greatest protector was gone, and her son's claim to anything at all was suddenly worth nothing in Roman eyes. She'd built her entire strategy around one Roman patron and just watched him die on a marble floor. She needed another, and the man who came looking for her next would give her the two most extraordinary years of her life, using the same instinct that had made her, just at a much bigger scale. In 41 BC, Mark Antony, now one of the three men effectively ruling the Roman world, summoned Cleopatra to answer accusations that she'd funded his rivals. She didn't arrive as a supplicant. Word of what's coming reaches Tarsus before she does. A barge is sailing up the Cydnus, gold at the stern, purple sails visible from the riverbank long before anyone can make out who's aboard. Attendants dressed as nymphs and cupids moving among the oars, all of it timed to music drifting off the water. By the time the barge is close enough to see her face, the marketplace has already emptied out. Antony is left standing alone, in the square he summoned her to, waiting for a defendant, while the entire city runs down to the river instead. Then the queen he came to interrogate steps off the barge dressed as Aphrodite, and the meeting he'd planned, accusations, questions, and apology owed to him, simply doesn't happen. She never answers a single charge. She just has to be looked at. Antony, expecting to interrogate a suspect, ends up hosting a queen who has just publicly outstaged him in his own province. If this were happening today, it would be the ancient equivalent of walking into a hostile meeting and instantly becoming the only thing anyone in the building can talk about for a week. She didn't out-argue him. She outstaged him on his own turf on the first afternoon. This is the clearest window into how Cleopatra operated. She didn't win Antony over by seduction, not in the way that word gets used against her. She won him over by showing, in one afternoon, total command of spectacle and timing, the same tools Antony relied on to hold power in Rome himself. She met him as a peer who happened to also be dazzling, not as a prize waiting to be won. What followed was nearly a decade of real partnership, twin children, then a third, Egyptian wealth, quietly propping up Antony's campaigns against Parthia, and a working alliance between Rome's most powerful general and the last independent monarch of the Mediterranean's richest kingdom. By her mid-30s, Cleopatra was ruling one of the wealthiest states on earth, allied to the most powerful man in Rome, mother to the biological son of one Roman dictator and the children of another. This is the apex, not a romantic conquest, but a genuine geopolitical achievement most rulers in her position never came close to touching. Built largely on her ability to control how the two most powerful men in Rome saw her. And it's right at this peak, not during any battle, not during any military defeat, that the real war against her begins. In 34 BC, Antony makes one public decision that hands his rival in Rome everything he needs to take the same thing that built her and use it to erase her. Historians call the ceremony the Donations of Alexandria. And on the day it happened, in 34 BC, it must have felt to Antony like the triumphant consolidation of everything he and Cleopatra had built together. In front of a huge assembly, staged with all the theatre Cleopatra had always understood better than anyone, he declared Caesarion the legitimate son and heir of Julius Caesar, named him King of Kings, ruling jointly with Cleopatra as Queen of Kings, and formally handed over huge stretches of Roman-held Eastern territory to Cleopatra and her children by Antony. Back in Rome, Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, and by now Antony's direct rival for control of the entire Roman world, did not need to invent a scandal. He only needed to describe accurately what had just happened and let Roman audiences draw their own furious conclusions. A Roman general handing away Roman territory to the children of a foreign queen, one of whom was being positioned as a rival heir to Caesar's own name. This is worth pausing on because it's the whole story compressed into a single afternoon. Cleopatra's actual crime, in Roman eyes, wasn't seduction. It was being visibly, undeniably present at the center of Roman power. a foreign monarch with real influence over a Roman general's decisions, in a political culture that had no category for a woman like that. Rome didn't have language for brilliant foreign head of state and legitimate ally. It only had language for threat. Then Octavian played his best card. He seized Antony's will, supposedly filed with the Vestal Virgins, and had it read aloud in the Senate. It said Antony wanted to be buried beside Cleopatra in Alexandria, not Rome. Historians still argue about how much of that document was genuine. It didn't matter. Rome heard what Octavian needed them to hear. Their general hadn't just picked up a foreign ally, he'd stopped being Roman. And here is the detail that tells you everything about how deliberately this was constructed. When Rome finally declared war in 32 BC, the Senate did not declare war on Mark Antony, a fellow Roman and a former consul. Declaring war on a Roman citizen looked too much like what it actually was, a civil war. So Rome declared war on Cleopatra instead. One woman, a foreign queen, made the official, legal justification for a war that was, underneath the paperwork, entirely about which Roman would rule Rome. It's the ancient equivalent of a company blaming market conditions, instead of admitting the CEO and the founder can't stand each other. Read that again, because it's the single most important fact in this entire story. The Roman Republic went to war against Cleopatra personally rather than admit it was fighting itself. She wasn't a casualty of that propaganda. She was manufactured on purpose to be its entire justification. And notice the tool being used against her. Cleopatra had spent her whole life proving that the person who controls the image controls the outcome. Octavian had just proven the same instinct works in reverse. Control the image of your enemy, and you don't need to control anything else. Octavian had the story now. He still needed the ending to match it, which meant he needed her alive, in chains, walking through Rome. What happens next is the one place his plan and hers finally collide head-on. The war that followed was decided almost entirely at sea, off the coast of Actium in 31 BC. Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet was outmaneuvered by Octavian's admiral Agrippa, and partway through the battle, Cleopatra's squadron broke through the line and sailed south, away from the fighting, with the war chest still loaded aboard her flagship. Roman writers, and most retelling since, have treated this as panic, a woman's nerve failing her at the critical moment, abandoning her lover to save herself. It's worth noting what that reading conveniently ignores. She left with the treasury, not without it, on ships that appear to have been ready for this exact move before the battle even began. Modern historians increasingly read it not as flight, but as a pre-arranged extraction. The war at sea was already going badly, and a queen carrying the money that could fund continued resistance had far more reason to preserve it than to die decoratively in a battle already lost. Antony, for reasons that still divide historians, chose to follow her rather than stay with his remaining fleet. Notice, again, how the story gets told afterward. A calculated withdrawal, carrying the resources needed to keep fighting, becomes, in the retelling, a woman's cowardice dragging a great man down with her. The facts survive. The framing around them is where she starts disappearing. And this is only the beginning of that process. Within a year, Octavian's forces reached Alexandria itself. In the chaos of the city's final defense, a false report reached Antony that Cleopatra had already died. He fell on his own sword rather than face capture, and was still alive. Barely, when the truth reached him. She wasn't dead at all. He was carried to her by most accounts and died in her presence, undone in the end by a rumor rather than a blade. Days later, standing at his tomb as a prisoner now rather than a queen, she found the words for it herself. Plutarch preserved what she said, that she couldn't even mark the grief properly, couldn't strike her chest or tear her hair, because her captors were keeping her body whole for a reason. It needed to grace the triumph over him. Even her mourning at this point was something Rome had already scheduled. Sit with that for a second. The one relationship in this entire story that wasn't built on hierarchy or performance, a decade of real partnership, ends because a lie outran the truth by a few hours. Even his death got taken out of her hands before she had a chance to control it herself. Cleopatra spent her final days negotiating directly with Octavian, trying to secure her children's futures rather than her own survival. Octavian wanted her alive, not out of mercy, but because a captured foreign queen, marched through the streets of Rome in chains, was the spectacle his triumph needed to look like a real victory. He needed the image. She was the only one who still understood how to deny it to him. Livy records what she told him, and historians consider it one of the only times antiquity preserved her actual words, rather than someone else's account of them. "I will not be led in a triumph." 6 words. It was the only army she had left, which is what those months of testing poisons on condemned prisoners had been for all along. On August 12th, 30 BC, in the sequence Plutarch recorded in detail, she bathes. She eats a final meal, unhurried enough that the guards outside relax. A countryman arrives at the door carrying a basket of figs. The guards check it, see nothing but fruit, and wave him through. Whatever else was hidden under that fruit, it got past them because by that point, nobody watching her was watching closely enough. A written message goes to Octavian. Her chamber door is sealed from the inside, her 2 women still with her. By the time anyone breaks it down, she's already gone, dressed in full royal regalia on her own terms. The traditional account says by the bite of an asp smuggled in among those figs, though Plutarch himself admits the physicians who examined her body afterward could never conclusively determine the actual method. What's certain is that none of it was improvised. The calm, the timing, the sealed door, all of it had been rehearsed, in one form or another, for months. It's the last time in this story she gets to control her own image. Octavian, still needing a queen in his triumph somehow, paraded an effigy of her through Rome instead, a statue with a snake coiled at its arm, standing in for the woman he never actually captured. Caesarion, the child from Act 4, the one we asked you to hold on to, was hunted down and killed on Octavian's orders shortly after. He was 17. Whatever he might have grown into, Rome had already decided the answer before anyone found him. The philosopher Arius, consulted on what to do with the boy, is said to have settled the matter with a line borrowed from Homer. "It is not good to have too many Caesars." Egypt itself was annexed, not as a Roman province governed by the Senate, but as Octavian's personal possession, the single richest prize of the entire war. And not coincidentally, the outcome all that propaganda about a foreign queen's corruption had been quietly building toward for years. What comes next should unsettle you more than anything that happened in Alexandria. Cleopatra only died once. Her actual self got killed a second time, and that killing took 2,000 years. And she was never once in the room for any of it. It starts almost immediately. Within months, poets writing for Octavian's court, now Augustus, hand her a permanent shape. Horace calls her a fatale monstrum, a deadly omen in a poem written to celebrate the very war that killed her. Propertius writes the same woman into his own verses. This isn't incidental color. It's the first draft of the Cleopatra most of the world's still pictures, written by the side that beat her, before she'd been dead a full year, before anyone who'd actually met her had any standing left to object. 100 years later, Plutarch writes the version of her life the modern world still trusts more than any other, built substantially on those same Augustan sources, decades after every Roman who could have pushed back was safely dead. 1,600 years after that, Shakespeare picks up Plutarch and turns her permanently into the seductress of English literature. 300 years after Shakespeare, Hollywood puts a face on it, and by the time Elizabeth Taylor's version reaches the screen, nobody watching needs convincing anymore. Nobody's arguing the case. It's simply what the name means now. Follow that chain all the way through and notice what never happens once across 2,000 years. Nobody who actually knew her ever gets to write a word of it. Every single link, the poet, the biographer, the playwright, the studio, was working from someone else's account of a woman who never got to submit anything in her own defense. She'd already lost this war the moment it stopped being fought with ships and started being fought with narrative. And that's the war that was never going to end in her lifetime, or after it. The administrator who reformed her kingdom's grain policy during a famine, who governed in a language none of her ancestors had bothered to learn, who staged her own entrances with the same precision Octavian later used to stage her downfall. She built her power on controlling the image. She just never got to control the one that mattered most, the one that outlived her. Except, it turns out, for one single word. In a museum in Berlin, there's a scrap of papyrus, a tax exemption, granted to one of Antony's own officers, dated 33 BC. At the bottom, in a different hand than the rest of the document, someone has added a single word, genesto, Greek for make it happen. Papyrologists are confident it's her own handwriting, the only physical trace of Cleopatra's actual voice to survive out of every single word ever written about her. One word got through untouched. Everything else got rewritten. Her chapter of this ended on August 12th, 30 BC. The chapter about what everyone else did with her afterward is still being written, including right now by whichever version of her you walked in here believing. Here's the uncomfortable question underneath all of this. Cleopatra is usually remembered as a story about seduction, about a woman's beauty and desire toppling powerful men. But that reading isn't a simplification of her story. It's the weapon that was used against her, still working just as it was designed to 2,000 years later. The real story is about something colder and far more universal. The tool she used to build her entire reign, control the image, and you control the outcome, only works while you're the one holding it. Lose, and it becomes the other side's tool instead. It works on you just as well as it ever worked for you. That isn't an ancient problem. It's the oldest one there is, and it's still running in modern life, just with faster machinery. The professional whose entire career gets reduced to the one meeting where they lost their temper. The public figure whose life's work disappears behind a single clip, stripped of context, repeated until the clip becomes the only thing anyone remembers. The difference between Cleopatra and someone going through that today isn't the mechanism. It's just the speed. You don't have to run a kingdom for this to apply to you. Think about the last time you watched someone's actual record get overwritten by whichever version was easiest for the winning side to tell. And think about how rarely, if ever, anyone went back afterward to check whether the story that stuck was the one that was true. If the people who beat you got to write the only version of you that survived, what would be left?